Good evening, everyone. I would first like to thank you, all of you, for being here. Everyone's been really attentively listening, and it's really great. And of course, the fellow panelists, I mean, I have to follow their league and stick to the deadline. And of course, as educators, you know that how we love to speak, and given the podium, I could speak a lot about international education coming from the background that I'm coming from, but I will definitely stick to the timeline. And my perspective is going to be very different from my fellow colleagues who've spoken here, because I'm speaking from a very international school education perspective, and of course, I do want you to understand, and I'm starting with an apology, not saying that I don't understand the Indian context. I'm born and brought up here. I completely understand the context, but where I am working right now, I'm speaking from a very international schools perspective. So sorry if it's a bit of a warped opinion, but I think it's important to look at the topic and look at what international schools in India are, what are the challenges and opportunities for our schools here. If we look back in terms of the education trends by the 60s, I mean, there was a change from a very traditional memorizing, same content for everybody, individual subjects, and a very didactic, teacher-centric approach to a very progressive, project-based, testing students on various skills, transdisciplinary, which is something I'm going to refer again back to that again, and constructivism, which Manjula also mentioned, and a very child-centric approach. So there was already a change that happened, and that was a trend in 60s, and that's when the international school movement started, or for that matter, the international baccalaureate movement started. Okay, it's not working. Okay, if we talk about international education, I mean, what does it mean? The first Director General of the International Baccalaureate, he defined it as the education for the whole child, and that's not something which is new to us educators. It's something we want to do, but I think sometimes are limited by the classrooms or the curriculum that we have to teach. What it means is to enjoy the environment. And I think it's really important that learning should be enjoyable instead of just being content heavy. And that's where the international education system started. Mr. Katyal defined it very, very well, what is international education. And it's not just about your affiliation to a curriculum. It's a broader set of values. A broader set of values, international mindedness, an education which breaks down the barriers of race, culture, and which has, and is an education for peace. And that's what international education means. So it doesn't matter, you could be any school or you could be any curriculum, but you could be international in a true sense if you adhere to these values and teach for and have that mission statement. What India has seen, I mean, international education isn't new to India. We've seen our leaders go for tertiary education outside the country. But I think what's changed now is that it's also changed with a lot of schools coming up in India, which wasn't a scenario a few years back. I mean, if I just talk about the IB schools, the first school was authorized in 1976. And then now today, in 2013, we have 100 schools. And given the way, the amount of number of applications that we get, this growth could easily double up in 5 to 7 years. And for us as an organization, it has its own set of challenges, and I will talk about those challenges in a bit. But we have seen a phenomenal growth. And of course, then there are other international boards which also exist. So there is a huge growth that India has seen over the last few years. In terms of what other, I mean, this has been touched by other speakers as well. What are some of the growth drivers? What are the opportunities for India? I mean, there is a clear demand and supply gap. And in that scenario, the international schools have also come up. In terms of government reform and higher spending, and of course somebody talked about it as a challenge in terms of RTE, but I think it's also an opportunity in the sense that the government is thinking about education. There is a greater emphasis on education, and with all the foreign university tie-ups which we foresee will happen in future, this will also have an impact on school education. So more and more international schools will come up. There's also been a change in the mindset of parents and teachers and all the stakeholders. I mean, in a middle-class family which couldn't afford an international education, now education is considered as an investment. There is greater affluence. So that's also something which is a great opportunity for schools in international education. I mean, if you look at the number of students who go abroad for tertiary studies, I mean, India was the second largest country, and that's the open doors data. So there's obviously a lot of students going abroad for studies, and what they found is that there is the international system of education plays importance on writing intensive skills, research skills, which the transition to the university is better when you're exposed to that kind of education system in your school life. So that's also led to a certain growth in the international schools. I mean, if you talk about global migratory trends, in the previous, I mean, in my parents' generation, when I remember we were moving from cities to cities, the decision was to be taken that do we put her into a state board or a CBSE board? At that point of time, for the sake of continuity, the decision was that it should be a CBSE, because if we're going to move every 2 years, pick up our bags and move every 2 years, then it's extremely important that there is a continuity of education. Similarly, with the way the global migratory trends are now, with the no national barriers, and parents are moving from country to country for their jobs, it's really important, and they look at a continuity of education. So there is a seamless transition for their child moving from one country to the other. Also, in terms of the standards, the international programs are globally benchmark standards, and it's easy for students to then move on to another country and study the similar program if offered in their country. And most of the times, the international programs are offered in those countries. In terms of for 21st century skills, and I know we heard this a lot even in the last session, the Fortune 500 came up with a list of desired skills, and in which teamwork, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving were the desired skills. If you look at international education, and I'm going to spend just a minute on this, what the international programs do, and I can particularly talk about the International Baccalaureate, is in the 4 programs that we offered, there is a continuum which runs through, and the continuum is approaches to learning. So it's not just about the content. We feel that these skills will lead to a better acquisition of knowledge. And that's the focus that the international programs have. In terms of challenges, I mean, I'm not going to say that there aren't challenges. There definitely are. And I'm going to obviously also add the challenge, one of the stakeholders as the international boards, and I'll talk about it in the end. Parents do this program a lot of times for pragmatic reasons. It's taken as a ticket or a passport for their child to study abroad. So sometimes the visionary or the philosophical aspect of the program is lost. And there is also, it's difficult sometimes for them to understand what the program is all about. Okay, I can hear my buzz, and I'm going to quickly run through this. In terms of students, the problems are pretty much similar. It eventually, sometimes it only means grades, grades, and grades. And so the understanding of the program is lost sometimes. Teachers, a lot of people talked about the lack of teachers in the country, so I'm not going to dwell on that so much. But I think one of the things that I do want to add in terms of the teachers is the change in the pedagogical shift, which is sometimes difficult to do. And what it does mean for school managements, which is a challenge for school managements, is to put in the resources to train those teachers to get the training, to imbibe the philosophy. And because there are so many schools now and it's a lot of choice, the teachers move from schools to schools, and I'm sure the managements would agree to that as a challenge for them to be able to retain teachers. In terms of government and regulatory bodies, I mean, Lena talked about the NOCs from governments. There's also problems at the higher ed level. The universities don't have an understanding of what an international education means. From where I am, and I've worked with universities and governments in India, 35% of students last year who did the diploma program at the end of, which is a 11th and 12th year, 35% of students wanted to stay in India. So there is a growth of students wanting to stay back in India, and it's really important to find them that pathway and to find an institution which will have the same learning styles as they are used to. So that's something which is a struggle as well. Last but not the least, from our perspective, from an international organization perspective, I think one of the challenges for us is to manage the growth and to retain the quality. And that's something that we also would like, feel is a challenge for us. And also to remember that it's the vision and the mission of the organization that's important. You have to value those aspects, and you will definitely do well if you value those and follow those.